So welcome, everyone. My name is Greer Luce. I am the Chief Communications Officer at the New Jersey Historical Commission, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to Native American Mascots, Creating Change in New Jersey. I'd first like to say that with gratitude, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of the Lenape people, called Lenapehoking. The Lenape are the original people of this land, and we acknowledge their continuing relationship with their territory. A legacy of colonialism, violence, displacement, migration, and settlement has shaped the region we now call New Jersey, impacting generations up to the present day. Still, nations, communities, families, and individuals persist in sustaining oral and cultural tradition and maintain a strong connection to this land and its waterways. This statement represents a commitment to beginning the ongoing process of relationship building with tribal nations, both in and outside of the state's colonized borders, and learning how we can, through respect and connection, support a truthful and inclusive understanding of Indigenous history and contemporary life. So again, welcome. Today's webinar is actually the third in a series of webinars that the Historical Commission has been hosting called New Jersey's Indigenous Voices. These programs were developed in partnership with the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs, as well as a planning committee co-chaired by Dr. Jameson Sweet, Assistant Professor of American Studies at Rutgers University, and Claire Garland, Executive Director of the Sand Hill Indian Historical Association. We want to thank the commission members of the Commission on American Indian Affairs, as well as their staff, in particular, Rowena Madden, Michelle Perez, and Vinnie Finellis for all of their assistance in putting together these programs. We'd also like to thank the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, who has sponsored this entire webinar series. We have an excellent panel of speakers today ready to contextualize the history, psychological impact, and controversy behind racist and offensive Native American mascots. We look forward to learning from our speakers who are engaged in removing these mascots in New Jersey and nationally, and are here to share information and actionable steps for creating change. Please remember to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the program. We will have a limited amount of time to answer questions at the end of the webinar and may not be able to address every question. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared via YouTube, the Commission's YouTube page, following today's event. It is now my pleasure to pass the baton over to my colleague, our moderator for today's panel, Noelle Lorraine Williams. Noelle is the Director of the African American History Program at the New Jersey Historical Commission. So without further ado, Noelle, I'll pass things off to you.
Oh, thank you, Greer, so much. I'm so honored to help moderate this panel today. Again, I would like to join my colleague in stating welcome to Native American Mascots, Creating Change in New Jersey. We are honored and thankful to have the opportunity to present this topic for conversation and action today. Specifically, as we continue to reimagine a community that embraces respect and history of all the people who live here or call this place home. I would like to introduce our first panelist, Savannah Romero. Savannah Romero is a member of the Eastern Shoshone Nation and the Movement Building and Organizing Manager at IllumiNative, a racial and social justice organization whose mission is to build power for Native people by amplifying contemporary Native voices, stories, and issues to advance justice, equity, and self-determination. Before joining IllumiNative, she worked at the National Indian Education Association, where she later became a board member as a tribal policy aide for the U.S. House of Representatives and a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant in New York City. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington and a master's degree in public policy and administration from New York University. Please join me in welcoming Savannah Romero. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noelle. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here today. Hello, Hans and Sikam Dabe. My name is Savannah Romero. I am Eastern Shoshone. I'm very excited to share with you all today a little bit about IllumiNative and our work in building power and for Native people. So first, I just want to briefly say our mission at IllumiNative is to amplify Native voices, stories, and issues to build power for Native peoples in order to advance justice and equity and self-determination. The ways in which we go about doing this are really within the realm of narrative and cultural change strategy, and we work mainly within the areas of pop culture by amplifying Native stories and voices across mainstream media, and then actionizing that, that narrative change strategy through our movement building work. So to begin our topic today, I just want to state that oftentimes when we talk about colonization, we talk about it as something that happened in the distant past. And I want to just, I think, ground us within the framework of understanding that colonization is an ongoing process. It is a continuation of colonization is still ongoing, right? Our communities are still very much experiencing the effects of colonization and the continuing dispossession of land. I'm going to share my screen differently here because I realize this one is setup is not going to work. So I can view my notes. Okay. IllumiNative was really birthed from our Reclaiming Native Truth research, which found it was the first public opinion research project ever done about and by Native people. And what it did was it surveyed thousands of Americans, as well as taking a landscape analysis of many sectors of our society, including our education system, our judicial system, our legislative system, and so on. And what the report found, the main finding that relates to what we're talking about today, is that the erasure of Native people has been institutionalized. It has been made deliberate. And that really invisibility is the way that modern day racism against Native people manifests today in society. When we look at how we proceed with narrative change, one thing that is very important for us to understand is the landscape. And what we find is that invisibility is one of the largest barriers impacting Native people today. So some of the main findings of the Reclaiming Native Truth report found that in our K-12 system in the country, 27 states make no mention of a single Native person in the K-12 curriculum. And within the states that do make a mention of a Native person, 87% of those states failed to mention a Native person after a 1900s context. So on the rare occasion that Native people are showing up in our K-12 system, they are showing up only in a they're only showing up as existing in the past, right? So there are no really representations of contemporary Native people today. When we are being discussed in the K-12 system, we're seen as only existing in the past, right? Which then contributes to the continued erasure and invisibility of contemporary Native people today. I can't tell you in my personal experience how many times I've gotten comments when people inquire about my ethnicity or race, and I tell them that I'm Indigenous, I tell them that I'm Native American, that a common response is actually, I didn't know that Native people still existed, or I didn't, I thought that all Native people had died. That is an incredibly common comment for me to get, for other people in my community to receive as well. So you can see, right, as a Native woman growing up in this country, those tangible real life experiences and interactions that I have with everyday Americans who don't realize that my community, my people are still here very much, right? And I think when we think about narrative change, when we think about the stories that we hear true, and this is where I'll challenge everyone in this conversation today to lean into those moments of uncomfortability, because the narratives that we have been told about this country and the stories that we hold dear about the founding of this country are fundamentally false. Because our K through 12 system does not uphold a narrative, largely does not uphold the narrative, or really acknowledge that the true founding of this country was one that was based on exploitation of labor and extraction of natural resources that came at a cost to enslaved people from Africa through their stolen lives and through the stolen land and resource of Indigenous people. Right now, our K through 12 system does not acknowledge that truth. And I think we're in a moment right now where we're moving towards advocacy of wanting to embed that within our K through 12 system, but right now that is not the case. The Reclaiming Native Truth report also found, while doing a landscape analysis of media, that Native Americans make up between 0 and 0.04% of characters in primetime TV and film. And that they also, when you search Native American on Google, that 95% of the first 100 images are from the 19th century. So again, Native people are very much represented as existing within the past and not in contemporary society. These statistics are interesting because they have shifted slightly since the Reclaiming Native Truth report was published in 2018. And we see that shift come largely due to, in terms of Google images, largely due to the election of Congressman and now Secretary Holland and Congresswoman Sharice Davids. Those are many of the images that now show up when you Google Native American. We've also seen a historical 1.5 years of Native representation in TV and film with the release of Rutherford Falls and now Reservation Dogs. We had one of the first Native filmmakers premiere at Sundance as the feature film for a wild Indian. And so we see that, in the recent years, that there has been more representation of Native people on TV and in film that have started to shift that narrative and bring visibility and awareness about Native people. So what are the effects of invisibility? 72% of Americans rarely encounter or receive information about Native Americans. And then 78% of Americans that were polled know little to nothing about Native Americans. So what Reclaiming Native Truth really made us realize is that invisibility doesn't just happen. It is made deliberate and it is systematized by institutions of power. And when we think about narratives generally, whether it's pop culture or media or in the instance of K through 12 education, so much of our perceptions about the world and the narratives that we hold dear and the myths that we hold deeply, right, are informed by what we're learning in school. Just really quickly, I think when we think about what we're learning in school and how kind of the narratives that we are exposed to through our K through 12 education system, through pop culture, these are the narratives that are embedded in people that will then go on to become doctors and will go on to become members of Congress and judges and people in our society that hold real, tangible decision-making power that will ultimately affect these communities in tangible ways. So one of the pieces of Reclaiming Native Truth looked at members of Congress and really just trying to understand what was the understanding of our federal policymakers. And what we found largely is that that even members of Congress, people who are making decisions at our highest levels of government, know very little to nothing about Native communities and the history really of violence that has been carried out against Native communities throughout the history and the formation of this country. So this slide is really just speaking to the cycle of institutionalized erasure. And I think, again, when we think about our K through 12 system and how that informs our narratives and our understandings of pop culture, right? And how that plays out and the messages that we receive from that exposure. And then how that has real life tangible consequences. One example of what that looked like in the last year and a half is with the pandemic. I think in the early stages of the pandemic, there was little to no discussion as to what the effects that pandemic was having in reservation communities and in Native communities. And really, I think, the COVID was having a disproportionate impact in Native communities. And a lot of that was due to resource allocation. A lot of that was also due to the fact that there's many reservation communities that actually don't have access to clean drinking water in this country, right? And so if you don't have access to running water, you can't necessarily wash your hands all the time consistently, right? So these are some of the infrastructural barriers, but what that meant, right? That when nobody was talking about the devastating impacts that COVID was having in Native communities was that tribes were actually left out of the first rendition of the CARES Act. And it was in that moment that, IllumiNative, along with our partners, really mobilized to make sure that that national media was paying attention to not only the ways in which COVID was disproportionately impacting Native communities, but also the ways in which tribes and Native communities were taking initiative and being innovative in the ways in which they were keeping their communities safe. Throughout the last year and a half, tribes have gone above and beyond, oftentimes, exceeding the safety measures of the states that they're within to make sure that their communities are safe by instituting mask mandates, by closing the reservation borders to non-tribal members. And so, we've seen, even though the pandemic has had devastating impacts on Native communities, we also see a strong sense of community care, and we actually see highest vaccination rates coming out of Native communities right now as well. So the void that's left by invisibility is filled then with myths, oftentimes myths, toxic stereotypes, and inaccurate portrayals in movies, TV, news, and media. One of the ways that this happens is through racist sports mascots, which we're going to get into a little deeper as we move further in today's discussion. But I just want to walk you through some of the most pernicious myths and stereotypes that impact Native people. All of these narratives have been given to us through pop culture, from TV, from movies, etc. For many non-Native people, one of the only ways that they see or interact with Natives is through sports mascots, which is one of the reasons why they are one of the most destructive forms of racism that we see today. Racist sports mascots often encourage racist fan behavior, the characterization of Native people as being part of the past, right? As not seeing fully Native people as they exist in contemporary society. Really, racist sports mascots, what it is a mockery of Native people. Some examples of this mockery are fans adorning sacred headdresses, using war whoops, or the tomahawk chop, as is famously part of the Kansas City Chiefs kind of fan behavior. And really what this is it's a non-Native view of what Native culture is. And in this process, cultures and traditions and customs are being violated by this fan behavior. It becomes a way in which it becomes acceptable and normal for non-Native people to dress up and play Indian. And we know that this has not only is this incredibly violent behavior, but it has incredibly devastating and harmful effects, namely for Native children, right? We know that it leads to increased suicidal ideation, that it negatively impacts the way that Native children and people see themselves, and it also increases racist tendencies in non-Native youth. The second kind of dominant way that Native representation shows up is often in Native imagery that's used in movies and TV for a oftentimes white protagonist that is seeking to find themselves, right? That is seeking to find themselves by participating in some type of Native Indigenous ceremony. So it kind of shows Native people as this magical, mystical Indian helping a white protagonist move forward in their own personal journey. And again, this is an incredibly destructive narrative. It's based in inaccurate portrayals of Native culture. It's oftentimes non-Native actors in red face, right, dressing up and playing Native characters. And we know, again, that this leads to increased feelings of shame for Native people, and that it does increase racist behavior in non-Native people. Lastly, the last narrative I want to touch on really quickly, and is one of the most destructive narratives that exists in popular culture, is specifically about Native women. It's the hypersexualization of Native women. Native women face some of the highest rates of physical and sexual violence. 4 out of 5 Native women are affected by violence in this country. And I think this is a really important narrative to understand because it's a part of pop culture that, for example, in Halloween costumes, you can still go to many Halloween stores today and see sexy Pocahontas or whatever it's called costumes. This then impacts the way that we see Native women and how we treat them. It contributes to the dehumanization of Native women, which ultimately leads to the violence of Native women. And in this country, as well as in Canada and Mexico, we are suffering through an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And it's not talked about as much as it should be, but really, we have to understand that it's these images and these portrayals of Native women that contribute to this violence. So with all of that, there is light at the end of the tunnel, fortunately. And this is kind of where IllumiNative work comes in, is really, we know that there are ways to shift American consciousness, and we do that by disrupting and interrupting invisibility, smashing toxic stereotypes, and amplifying contemporary and accurate Native voices, stories, and issues. We know that representation does matter and that it is critical, again, for media, pop culture, and education, and why these parts of our society are so important in the work to advance equity and social justice for Native people. One exciting thing that we found is that nearly 80% of Americans want to learn more about Native people, and most Americans, when they were surveyed through this process, were actually frustrated that they didn't learn a lot of the information that we had provided for them in school. So we know that there is an audience demand in the media and entertainment community, and we know that Americans really do want to know true, authentic, and contemporary stories of Native people. So really quickly, in the last few minutes I just wanted to name our narrative change moment. In 2020, there was a moment that was largely made possible through the movement for Black Lives that allowed us, IllumiNative, along with our partners, and off the backs of decades and decades of advocacy, to push forward to push forward our campaign for the Washington football team to change its racist name. And fortunately, we were able to be successful in those efforts by combating, right, this existing dominant narrative that Native people somehow feel honored or not offended by mascots, when really the true narrative is that our research tells us that racist mascots are harmful, right? That they increase suicidal ideation in young people. And we really took that moment that happened in 2020 to push forward this conversation and to bring it to national consciousness. And that was done through a multitude of different tactics acting together in unison. And I can speak more to that if people are interested. But I think I'm at time, is that correct, Noelle? So I'll stop there and just offer, please feel free to reach out if anyone has questions or wants to learn more. Thank you, Weehoo.
Thank you, Savannah, Romero. We really appreciated that, and we look forward to having folks ask questions. I see people are putting questions in the question and answer. Feel free to continue to put questions there, and we'll address as many as we can before the conclusion of the program. Okay, I would like to invite Dr. Stephen Myers. He will present. First, I will introduce him to the audience. Okay. Dr. Stephen Myers is a licensed psychologist in private practice in Oradell, New Jersey, with 14 years of experience in New Jersey public schools. He has an acute understanding of the legal and ethical obligations public schools have to equitably address the learning and mental challenges of its students. In his practice, Dr. Myers provides psychotherapy and evaluation services for adults, adolescents, children, and families, as well as parent coaching and consultation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Myers.
Good afternoon, everybody. Humbled and honored to be here today. Hopefully my slides are showing up. Does that look okay, Noelle?
Yes, they're perfect. Thank you.
Good, good. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to give a little bit more background about, how I got here. So I've been a psychologist for about a decade or so and worked at Pascack Valley High School as a school psychologist for 11 years. I recently left to engage in full-time private practice in June of this year. But when I started in 2010, the mascot at Pascack Valley was the Indian. And by the time I left, we had changed and retired the mascot and adopted to the Panthers. So I want to talk about two different pathways. One is my own personal journey on how I became an advocate for the retirement of native themed mascots, as well as Pascack Valley's journey in the 10 years that I was there, and the time even before I was there, and the controversy and the struggle of making this change happen. I do believe that in discussing my personal experience, as Savannah was alluding to, has significant insight into how we can achieve change at a personal level, and how we can extend that change outwardly to impact institutions. I think education is really the primary pathway to achieve that type of change. And for me, it was the compelling body of psychological research, which I'm going to share with you today as well. So what we'll also talk about is some of the barriers and inroads to change. Savannah alluded to a few of those today, but in particular, what we experienced working in a school setting and how we were able to develop change within that institution. I do want to say I am merely a representative of the work that was done by a number of colleagues, including teachers in the history department, a very strong and passionate group of students and community members that were able to do this. So I'm humbly representing all of those folks while we're here today. So I do want to note, and it's really important for me to say this, I'm a non-native person, and as Savannah was mentioning, the issue of invisibility was something that I've experienced as well. For the first 22 years of my life, I had never met a native person, and my exposure was simply what I had seen on narrow depictions from TV and the media. I attended a high school where our mascot was the warrior. I remember watching movies like Dances with Wolves and The Last Mohicans, and I wrote a senior term paper on the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was written exclusively by white historians. So, what Savannah was saying, I think it's 78% of individuals, or 72%, have not had exposure to contemporary native people. And that was similarly the case for myself. What was really groundbreaking and changed a lot of my views and transformed how I saw this issue was my training as a psychologist. In 2004, I was enrolled in a course in social psychology with Dr. Stephanie Freiberg. And if you're not familiar with her work, she is a social psychologist and Tulalip tribal member. And she did a ton of research and work on the negative implications and impact on a mental health level of mascots and stereotypes on American Indian people. And so what I want to do is use that information as it was the catalyst for me to transform my view and to provide that information, and how we can use this information to help transform people's understanding of this key issue. So when I talk about this is the slides that Dr. Freiberg was kind enough to share with me. The primary research study that was conducted, and she shared with us in 2004, but it was pre-publication at the time, was taking groups of students, and these were students, American Indian students living on reservations in Arizona, and asked them to be part of a research design, which was called, it's a randomized control study, which takes the group and randomly assigns them to 4 different conditions. And in one of the conditions, the students were primed by viewing a picture of the Disney character Pocahontas. In another one, it was to look at the Cleveland Indians mascot, Chief Wahoo. And another condition was to look at a stock card list of negative stereotypes about American Indian people. And then it was a control condition, which was not exposed to any of those things. After which, all the participants completed a self-esteem survey. And if you can look at the graph on the slide there, what you see is the students who completed or looked at the images of Pocahontas and Chief Wahoo demonstrated decreased levels of self-esteem compared to the control group. And these are statistically significant findings. So the research shows, and this is, as Savannah was alluding to, there is psychological impact, negative psychological impact associated with mascots on American Indian youth. Now, the next slide, which I've shown, to students when I go into classrooms to talk about this issue, and they look at this slide and they think, wow, that doesn't look so good. Well, the next one is kind of alarming too. So there's this inverse relationship. When European American youth are exposed to the same research design. So we're just changing the participants from American Indian students to European American youth. What you see is an inverse relationship. And this is what I think is quite disturbing. And I think probably why we find so many challenges in changing the use of mascots. But European or white students demonstrated increased levels of self-esteem after viewing stereotypic depictions of American Indian people and negative stereotypes on a cardstock image. So when you look at these slides side by side, and you see that control condition and that line that cuts across the top being American Indian students and the bottom being European American students, you could see very clearly the distinction between a depressed self-esteem and an enhanced self-esteem as a result of these mascots. So there's been a lot of follow-up research. I'm just pointing to the primary research study of Dr. Freiberg and her colleagues. And some other studies looked at things like community efficacy and possible selves or future goals. And mascots have demonstrated the same effect of depressing how American Indian students felt about their community and about their future possible goals. There's also research that shows there's no difference, because this comes up oftentimes as, well, I believe that this mascot represents American Indian people in a respectful manner. Well, in fact, the research shows that there is no difference in terms of the effect it has on American Indian students, whether it is a Chief Wahoo caricature or whether it's a University of Illinois mascot, which is a human dressed in native regalia. There's no difference. So, why I got involved in this was Dr. Freiberg's work, and also what the APA has to say about this. The American Psychological Association is the largest group within the world of psychologists. It's 130 members. I happen to be a member of it. And the position statement that it holds is that that schools, K-12 institutions, and all institutions should immediately retire native mascots. And this was a call from 2005. So this has been ongoing for some time. The position statement states that it limits the educational experience of all people by reinforcing negative racist stereotypes. It's a form of discrimination, and it limits the ways in which American Indian nations are able to portray their culture. It allows for, in the case of the school I work for, predominantly white culture, to define what American Indian culture is and what it looks like for a largely majority white student body, and it allows them to see people in a certain light. Now, so here's what I ended up walking into in 2010 when I took the position as a school psychologist. And I come into the school with, all this training and background, and I found myself in very deep conflict about how could we make a change like this? How could we, reverse the course of something that has been embedded within a school culture for over 70 years? And year after year, I'd find myself, trying to speak to people and trying to inform people. I started talking to my colleagues, but it felt like everything was falling on deaf ears. In fact, it wasn't. The large majority of people that I spoke to were ignorant of the research and ignorant of, in a true sense of the word, ignorant of the facts of the negative impact that this has. And after a while of working with some of these great history teachers that we had on staff and our students, we were able to kind of help formulate a path towards change. But before I want to get into that path, I want to just share with everyone some of the difficulties, those barriers, and in my belief, some of the barriers that we could find could help us lead to the inroads. I mean, there's a lot of swimming upstream, that causes it, to hit that resistance points. And one of which was, I believe it was 2005, with the Human Rights League at the school decided to, they wanted to go before the Board of Education and present their concerns about the mascot. Ultimately, it was decided it would go to a student vote, which was uneducated. And that led to no change because no education had taken part. The students were not told about why this was an issue. They were just asked whether or not they found it to be offensive. And when we get into discussing whether something is offensive or not, it's really hard to define that if you're a white person. I say to people all the time, I cannot be personally offended because I'm a non-native person. But what I can tell you as a psychologist is there's an ample body of research that says that this is harmful to Native people. And if we believe that we are, and most people want to believe this, we care about other people and we do not want to do harm, then you really have to evaluate whether or not you want to support a mascot. So, you know, I don't want to go over too much because Stephanie did cover a lot of some of these barriers and inroads, but I just want to talk about a few. As she mentioned that, I'm sorry, Savannah, I said Stephanie. Savannah mentioned that this romanticized admiration for Native people kind of translates to people feeling, well, these mascots are respectful and depict strength and bravery. And, you know, I think that's a potential inroad because, you know, one of the things that's not an inroad is by saying, you know, to people that this is racist, because if we simply explain and say it's racist and it's offensive, we're not going to get them to understand why it's a form of racism. So what I prefer to say to people at times is, I believe that this represents a form of racism, and let me tell you why. And let me tell you how I came to change my attitudes and my perceptions about this issue and invite participation and invite people to come in to evaluate for themselves some of the research findings without, alienating people. Because I think sometimes there's a tendency, I participated in that tendency myself, to alienate people in this mission. There is a strong pull in, I think, K-12 institutions, and particularly high school settings, where a mascot becomes a sense of identity for a community and for students, particularly because of sports. And in a sense, there's this identity confusion. You know, when we have sports and, and all of us want to belong or feel like we belong to something, it's a part of group identity. The problem with mascots is that we have to understand and accept that it appropriates a false identity. It harms Native people, and we're teaching our children that it's acceptable to stereotype Native people. One of the third barriers that we frequently found was this deflection. And that was in the form of a lot of different things, with people asking questions, well, what about the Fighting Irish? What about the Seminoles? Can't we get representation from a Native group that says it's okay and we could represent them? How about we just change the logo? And that's what we did, the school did. They erased the logo, didn't address the mascot itself, and, in a way tried to whitewash it and just kind of paint over it. What about the budget costs to making these changes? What about the kids? Haven't they been through enough? And I look at these forms of deflection, and I think there's answers to all those types of questions. But I think the first thing is to first acknowledge the facts, that the mascots are harmful, and then we have to go from there, and then deal with the other questions as they come up, right? Because if we go off too much on a tangent of thinking about, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about that, we're moving away too far from the key issue, which for me is the harm that it causes. As I mentioned, I think in the course of this, I spent a lot of time banging my head against the wall and asking, why do people not understand this type of issue? Speaking to the choir of people that understood the issues that I was talking about. But what needed to be done was to seize on the opportunities when people have an ear and want to listen, and to step into classrooms and to speak to students and to provide appropriate education to them. Because as Savannah alluded to before, many Americans want more accurate education. There is a clear divide between what kids are being taught, or what they historically have been taught, and what needs to be taught in K-12 education. And what, as Savannah also spoke to, the Reclaiming Native Truth Project has brought about a lot of facts that can help create change in the narrative. And one of the things that I gleaned from their research was the facts about systemic oppression, and the psychological research is a catalyst to change hearts and minds. It's something that can move people. And in this particular issue, which is a difficult issue, people don't want to create change around, and it could help produce that change. So this is, in a sense, I'll give you the kind of the chronology of how Pascagoula Valley came to make that change. And this started before my time with the Human Rights League, while a small group were vocal and, pushed for this change. And I think that those changes, while they didn't yield a successful change in changing the mascot back in 2004 or 2005, whenever it was the beginning. And it was the same kids that graduated back then that were able to participate in the current process. But what we had in our district around 2016 was we had made the news in a negative way for an incident of anti-Semitism, which caused the district to look at and evaluate and reflect on, are we an inclusive and equitable district? And so the district then, at a district level, the Board of Education adopted goals that were oriented around student equity and advancing equity for all students. And that required, you know, the really tough work of looking inwardly and evaluating our practices, evaluating how our students felt, evaluating how our faculty felt. We did things like, you know, we developed a district equity team. We started, you know, working on climate surveys. We solicited student narratives. And all along, these two amazing, you know, history teachers formed a club called One Spirit, which worked to advocate for Native issues, traveled to the Pine Ridge Reservation, and advocated for the retirement of the mascot. So we had these different forces that were working kind of in tandem and parallel. And really it was 2019, 2020 where we all kind of coalesced and we started working together. And that was the year where we produced, you know, the change by the end of the year. We started doing work on implicit bias training within the school district. And I was in classrooms talking to kids about the psychological research and really, you know, just putting out the information. Our history teachers were, you know, diving very deeply into the curriculum and looking at different sources and educating our kids. And let's be honest, you know, it wasn't to, you know, all welcome all the time, but it was something I think, you know, they felt was really worth the effort. So as we started doing this work, One Spirit began the work of putting together, you know, some presentation slides and work to present that issue to people in key leadership positions. So by June of 2020, on the heels of George Floyd's murder, there was a board meeting. And in that board meeting, it was held for about 3 hours. And faculty, myself included, and teachers, staff, students, former students called in to ask for the retirement of the mascot. The board motion to vote on the issue, and it was a unanimous decision to retire the mascot. And it was a very proud moment for all of us. So when all this took place, you know, I'm going to skip over this now because I want to, you know, just make sure we give time to Dr. DeFreece. But one of the things that I think in terms of lessons learned was there is a lot of resistance. There is still resistance to changing things. But I think with, you know, the changes in Washington's football team, the Cleveland Indians, and the fact that the state of Maine banned Native mascots in 2019 from K-12 institutions, I do believe that there is more that can be done. I do believe that New Jersey should have a similar state ban for mascots. It's very difficult and challenging for individual school districts to make this change, but it's not impossible, and I think it's worth the effort to do it. And I do believe that this change is certainly possible. And I think that's it. So I thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions that anybody might have.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Dr. Myers. I really appreciated that, as everyone else has. I have to be honest. These presentations are both intellectually impactful, but they're also deeply emotionally impactful because of the things we don't know, but also just understanding the different levels of harm that are institutionalized within our various systems. So I am honored and thankful that we're able to present this topic today, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this panel definitely has a very deep resonance to me, and I'm sure others. I am pleased to welcome our final presenter, who is a friend of the commission. And I will share with you her bio. Dr. Eileen DeFreece is a lifelong resident of New Jersey and a member of the Ramapough Lenape Nation. Dr. DeFreece is Associate Professor of Writing and Literature at Essex County College in Newark, New Jersey, where she teaches composition and literature courses that often include reading Native American authors. Professor DeFreece holds multiple MA degrees in writing and in English and Ph.D. in literature in English from Rutgers University. She also serves as a member of the New Jersey State Commission on American Indian Affairs, along with representatives from the Nanticoke, Lenape, and Powhatan Lenape nations, which, like the Ramapough, make up 3 New Jersey state recognized nations. Dr. DeFreece is adamant about removing negative images of Native Americans from schools, team sports, and the media. She believes that education is the best way to diminish and end the use of demoralizing Native American images. Please join me in welcoming Dr. DeFreece.
Thank you, Noelle, and thank you for having me. This topic is something I've been working on for quite a while. I did some research. Of course, I have 15 minutes or so, so I'm not going to try to overwhelm you with it. I'm just going to pull up the list. I made a list of all the New Jersey schools that use Indian negative Indian symbolism. I just want you to take a look at it. Here we are. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong one. Sorry. There we go. Okay. I just wanted you to see how many schools are represented. Of course, Dr. Myers mentioned Pascack, and they're there. They changed their names, Indian name they changed from Indians to Panthers in 2020. And these are the schools that I'm very happy to see have changed, but there are some challenges even with changing these names. Immaculate Conception High School changed from Apaches to Blue Wolves in 2004. Parsippany High School, Parsippany Trail, which is Parsippany Troy Hills, New Jersey, changed from Redskins to Red Hawks in 2001. And the problem school here is Scotch Plains Fanwood High School in Union County, New Jersey. Even though the Native logo was replaced in 2004, the fans continue to wear the old logo. They dress in Native headdresses at games, etc. And this is an example of the need for the education, explaining why these symbols must be replaced, why these symbols are damaging psychologically to especially Native children, who must tolerate them in schools. As Savannah pointed out earlier, a lot of these schools, they don't recognize their the Native children in the schools. The same thing happens in Mahwah, and I should say Bergen County, especially Mahwah. They have no choice but to recognize the Ramapough Lenape. But in the school district, our children have a very difficult time. We have children who suffer from depression, dropping out too soon, having babies before graduation. There's drug issues, alcoholism, the same issues that many tribal nations deal with, whether on reservations, especially reservations, in which we know. So the schools that you see mentioned here still continue with their Native American mascots and symbolism. And you can see how many there are. There's 28 listed here. Some schools, high schools, never had Native American symbolism. I know that I grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, and Montclair High School, which is my alma mater, we always had a bulldog, and we were known as the Bulldogs. So, I mean, this, being Native American growing up there, I never really felt that my school, Montclair High School, carried any, I don't remember any negative symbols. Most of the symbols, as was pointed out, come from popular culture, as Savannah pointed out. And also the erasure, that we just don't exist anymore because guess what, we're all dead. When in fact we are here. So if we go through these, this list, and some of the schools are named like Indian Hills High School, and then, you know, which means it's free to use any Indian symbols because who's gonna complain? Manalapan, Newton High School in Newton. Some of you may recognize these schools. They might be in your town. Williamstown High School, Buena Regional High School, Cherokee High School, and we don't even want to talk about the Cherokee, the vehicle, right? The Grand Cherokee. My sister always jokes about that. Another idea that has come to me is this, and this goes out to educators, because as an educator, I always make it my business to teach not just Native American authors, but also, you know, African American authors, Jewish American authors, you know, Native Hispanic authors, you name it. I will dig them up, men, women, children, topics, and authors. I recently, and I'm always looking at these issues, but I recently did some research and I found that there are approximately 2,000 teams in the United States that utilize Native American mascots. And the majority of them are associated with schools. And so the idea is that how do we educate not just the students, but these school boards, who many of them are very resistant, alumni associations, which would have fought to change any change in these Indian heads floating in the middle of the floor of their gyms. And that people want, it seems like there are so many intense conflicts over this mascot issue that I've noted that the focus on the differences in opinion, it's more on the different opinions rather than the negative effects of the mascots. And the advocating for educational decision makers to change them has become a kind of battle. Certainly here in New Jersey it has been, and because the Ramapough Lenape Nation does straddle the Ramapough Mountains, many of our tribal members do live on the New York side of the mountain and run into the same issues that we have. And I did make a list and mention 77 schools that had been noted, and then when I went back and looked at my research, I realized that some of those schools were on the New York side. So I eliminated them from the list so that to focus on the New Jersey schools. I find that the difficult part is teaching the truth about the Native American story instead of the false narratives that were pointed out, not to mention the psychological effects that Dr. Myers pointed out. And also Savannah Romero did the same on Native children and how it affects them. Because we're seeing that hugely in the Ramapough community when it comes to the public schools. The history has never been a good one for the Ramapough, and actually the people who lived in Malwa years ago really didn't even realize that our people were up there on the mountain. They thought we were all gone and moved out. And the only way that they were discovered was that the land surveyors went up on the mountain in order to draw the line between what was New York and what was New Jersey. And they actually wrote it in their report that there were Native Americans living up on that mountain in longhouses. So that certainly pointed out that, Native people were still in the area and functioning, but because of fear, living in the traditional ways, which is a good thing in a sense, because it creates an atmosphere where those traditions can be taught to the younger Ramapough coming up behind them. So yes, research is a very important part of this whole discussion, as Dr. Myers pointed out. One of the other things I noted, and and I think it's really sad, and it points to how people use these symbols and have no idea what they mean, is the number. I looked at schools all across the nation that use these symbols, and the one that caught my eye and sticks with me is the one where schools actually have teams, girl teams, called the squaws. Now, that is sad. Why? Because squaw means a woman's genitalia. It's, some people translate it as being a prostitute or something more offensive. And it's a shame that they don't know that, because no one should use that term for the name of a sports team that's associated with a school. It's unbelievable. But I am so happy to be a part of this panel, because it shows how the discussion offers people a broader societal context to the issue. It's not just about removing the names, the offensive names. Of course, we want them to, but just being able to share and to learn the actual history of why these are offensive. And many Native children probably do learn from their parents, etc., the history of their people. And part of what I wanted to look at also is how widespread this is throughout the New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, going from Galloway, places like Englishtown, which is more southern from where I am sitting right now. Hapakong, Piscataway, I'm just mentioning Pennsauken, Rawway, Toms River. Toms River currently is in the middle of a dispute. They're being petitioned by many people to change their symbol. And so they're in the middle of their dispute, as far as I know, from the last time I looked. And then there's the intermediate school also in Beechwood, the Toms River Intermediate School. Wayne Valley High School in Wayne, Weehawken High School in Weehawken, Eastside High School in Newark, Weequahic High School also in Newark, Dwight Morrill High School in Englewood, Keyport High School, Ocean High School, Shawnee High School in Berlin County, Burlington County, Manasquan High School and Manasquan, Wildwood High School and Wildwood, Watchung Hills Regional High School in Warren, and Lenape High School in Medford, New Jersey. You know, some of these schools do not have as much diversity as others. And I think that it's time that these schools become enlightened into to understand why these logos should not be part of an educational system. Okay, let me just switch this back. And it's shocking that we have that many high schools who use those symbols. Okay, I'm sorry. And I had some references, I'm sorry, at the end, so you can see some of my references. Okay, let me just switch. I just wanted to, before we end, I wanted for you to look at, I don't know what happened to it. Let's see. This was a piece that I wrote based on, you know, this whole topic of what these, and basically my point is, what is behind the Indian head? Why is it offensive? And I've had some of my students ask me that. Why is Indian head offensive? It's honoring the native people. And I said, no, it's not. It's not, it really isn't. Tomahawk chops, you know, Savannah showed these images, and as you can see, they are offensive. And there's other racist and demoralizing logos and images in American culture that people do not see. As I said earlier, they rather argue and focus on their differences in opinion rather than to look at the damaging effects of these images on children. So, I mean, we've been, well, I know people who have been fighting for 60 years to end these, for over 60 years to end these symbols. Okay, some of this, I just want to read you a couple of, I want you to look at a couple of quotes that I pulled from a text that I have ordered and have my students read that was published in 2018. He really lays it out in the prologue of his book, There. It's in the prologue of his book that I quoted because he provides a lot of history that is the real deal. It's definitely, you know, well-researched and okay, and one is the Thanksgiving thing. It's a big, the holiday is a big holiday. I remember being in school, I really didn't learn anything about the Native people because the focus was always on the Pilgrims or the colonizers. So whenever the month of November rolls around, most Americans prepare for Thanksgiving dinner. American schools across the nation, the plight of pilgrims was always the highlight and the focus in telling those 1620s meals in which, you know, Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoags was invited and brought many of his people to the feast. Every year in the Star Ledger, you get that story told around Thanksgiving time. So he, Tommy Orange, he writes, and this is a quote from his book, that 2 years later, there was another similar meal meant to symbolize eternal friendship. 200 Indians dropped dead that night from supposed unknown poison. Okay, that's just one idea, one reality that has been documented and points to why many people think it's okay to use these images, because they say they're all gone, they're all dead, but never stop to think, how did they all get dead? How? How come they're not here when there were millions and millions and millions of them here, tens of millions? Okay, so also, right, this is also part of the story that Massasoit's son, Chief Metacomet, also known as King Philip, and the Wampanoag people, who, by the way, are still here, who suffered cruelly by the Plymouth colony, which started the first Indian War. Ultimately, Metacomet's head was beheaded and drawn and quartered. If you don't know what that means, it's a footnote, and it's not very pretty. So Metacomet's head was sold for 30 shillings to the Plymouth colony. And that pretty much was the going rate for an Indian head during that time. The head was spiked, carried through the streets of Plymouth before it was put on display at the Plymouth colony fort for almost 25 years. When you know that, you could see why those floating Indian heads on the floors of many schools would be offensive. And because, Indian head, you could profit from them. In my research, I found that you got $7 for a male head, $5 for a woman, and $3, and I'm giving you our equivalent to a child's head. And so that means open season on the lives of Native American people. So that could be one of those myths where people say they don't exist anymore. Of course they exist. Why would you think they're all dead? Well, this is part of the history. That's part of the myth. And this is the real deal as to why. I mean, museum, I went to the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center in Connecticut, left there in tears because of the details that I read and studied over these disturbing massacres that occurred in 1637. For example, when 700 Pequot Native Americans who gathered for their annual corn dance, which is an important ceremony, were horrifically massacred when the colonists set their village on fire and shot any man, woman, or child that tried to escape. That's in the museum. Anyone can go there and see that. The Thanksgiving celebration included that the colonists were in Massachusetts in the Bay Colony. Part of it was kicking the heads of Pequot people through the streets like soccer balls. And that was also documented and Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, as well as other historical records of the Native people. Many of these, this information came from the colonists themselves, who kept diaries, who kept journals, who wrote letters back to people in Europe to explain some of the things that were happening in the quote unquote New World. And Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is an older text, but it's an American, it's an Indian history of the American West that was published in 1970. It documents so many broken treaties and the bounties on Indian heads that persisted into the late 1800s into the American West. And these heads, even there, were used as soccer balls. So these are atrocities that were common against Native communities that are shocking, horrific, and it's history. And part of the resistance of school districts may be, if they know anything about any of this, they might think it might be a little too hard for young people to know about. But I beg to differ. I beg to differ. Now, Tommy Orange was he's an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. He writes about one massacre story that he grew up with, and he shares it with that, you know, happened to, what he says happened to his people not that long ago, which speaks to the idea that colonization, it's far from being over. It's still in flux. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite African writers, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, wrote a book about that. You know, how do you decolonize a people's mind? Or in his case, the African mindset as survivors of colonization in Africa. He says, Tommy Orange writes, volunteer militia under Colonel John Chivington came to kill us. However, they did more than kill us. They tore us up, mutilated us, broke our fingers to take our rings, cut off our ears to take our silver, scalped us for our hair. They tore unborn babies out of bellies. They broke soft baby heads against trees. They took our body parts as trophies and displayed them on a stage downtown in Denver. Now, when we talk about these, you know, the Native people, and this makes, you know, having a Indian head floating in our gym floor is a way to honor our Native, you know, Native Americans. We're looking up to them, we're honoring them. That's because they don't know the history. I think that I believe that most people are decent and function with empathy. And I think if they knew some of these disturbing realities, that maybe then they would find a way. Teachers need to get together and come up with ways to give the true story about what happened. And a lot of those symbols would probably maybe disappear overnight. I mean, not literally, but the discussions would become more intense about, number one, how do we teach these children about what happened to the natives, the broken treaties, you know, the attacks, etc. So, see, too many Americans, they do prefer the myths about Indians, that because they're so pervasive in this culture. As was pointed out through movies, cartoons, and other media, makes the use and tomahawk chops, Indian heads, it makes them open season. Anybody can use them because it doesn't offend me. That attitude. And also the fact that Indians really didn't have red skin. The red skin came from the blood. That happens if somebody's going to cut your head off, it's going to have a lot of red blood on it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to laugh, but I'm just trying to make a point here. Now, I read this in the New Jersey Historical Commission, which I meant to put down as a source, and that was one I didn't think of at the last minute. But when Giovanni da Verrazzano came through down the Hudson in 1524, and this is coming from his journal. He said that that was the first contact, right, with the Atlantic coast, and which is currently New York. He came down the Hudson at night. There were so many Indian villages along the Hudson that he didn't even have to light his ship. But what was really interesting is how they were described in the crew, described the people, how they looked in the journals. It's really interesting because they were described as being tan or brown people, not red. There were some really critical points that were made in the book Native New Yorkers, The Legacy of the Algonquin People of New York, that was published in 2002 by Evan T. Pritchard, who is a descendant of the Micmac people that was part of the Algonquin. He's a great historian, and he writes about the indigenous peoples of New York and the surrounding areas. But he says that what started as a scholarly endeavor soon became a spiritual quest. And I'd like to end on that note because, yes, this is, for me, it's a spiritual quest, because that truth is much better than myth. And once we get at the truth, maybe people will start understanding why these negative stereotypes are offensive to Native Americans, and they should be offensive to Americans, period. I mean, that's my opinion, to know that these are the things that happened to Native people. And after the settlers, or say the colonists came, millions were killed just because of the germs from their mouths, because they came and, you know, the Native people died in high numbers. But the other realities, giving blankets to Natives, women affected with smallpox, that wasn't made up. That's a fact. I found it in several sources. So that, and then marching them, you know, across the country in the middle of the winter, and knowing that blankets are very important to Native culture. They use them to wrap their babies, to wrap themselves. And many, many died in those long walks. People need to remember that these symbols, they hurt Native American children, who certainly are aware of the meanings behind such logos, because they learned them growing up, especially the Indian head. That's so reminiscent of massacre and laws, colonial laws that said it's okay. As a matter of fact, if you kill them, you can get paid if you come back with their head.
Yeah.
Okay. So these are, I just meant to add that other source, but I just wanted to make that point. Some people say to me, oh, that's too negative. But you know what? If you go to Germany, they will take you to tours to Auschwitz, to other locations in Germany where Jewish people were tortured, starved, and murdered in huge numbers. It's no different. It's a Holocaust.
No.
Okay. And I can say that, you know, in closing, I can say that trauma is passed down. It's passed down to Native people, it's Native Americans, and it's passed down to African Americans as well. Mm-hmm. Because these atrocities happened over sometimes hundreds of years.
Yes, well.
Okay. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Eileen, or sorry to everyone else, Dr. DeFreece. Again, this is all, it's deeply impactful for several reasons. The fact that these were human rights transgressions, but as you and Savannah Romero explained at the beginning of both of your presentations, colonization is a continual process. And so in that sense, the silencing of the authentic history is something that continues to carry on. And it's something that's also a part of the process of dehumanizing and silencing Native American and other people of color in those histories that are still perpetuated in these systems and institutions that we are still a part of. I would like to invite all of the panelists to come back on the screen, including Greer. We had so much information for this panel, so we won't be able to address some of the questions that are in the chat box. But one of the questions that I think it would be important in closing to address is, if in any of your closing thoughts, if whether you all have any advice as far as putting pressure on state and federal departments to make educational changes, any next steps for that. And I see that also in the question and answer box, people also suggested organizations to align with, such as the New Jersey Interscholastic Athletic Association, the Coalition of Native American, Natives and Allies. But I would just like to know if any of the panelists have any closing thoughts on this. And then Greer will close the program.
Yeah, I can address that question just really quickly. The most impactful changes happen at that grassroots localized level. And it really is up to, we can talk about these really big moments in American society and cultural shifts, right? But ultimately it's the trickle-down effect of what it means to change the name of a racist mascot like the Washington football team or the Cleveland baseball team, right? And that it's really up to parents and organizers at the community level that are willing to bring those changes forward and to carry those movements out on the ground that are actually making dramatic changes across the country right now. So just encouraging folks. The National Indian Education Association is a great resource, along with the National Congress of American Indians, in terms of working with folks to help change mascots at the local level.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that too. Just the process that we went through, I think for years I had expected the people in leadership positions would just get this and understand it and then institute changes at administrative or board level, and that just doesn't happen. There's got to be pressure from the bottom up to put that pressure on people in leadership positions to make changes. Unfortunately, that just seems to be the case, and it really shouldn't be that way. I mean, but that's the resistance that we encountered, was a lot of resistance, that political and community-based pressure that caused people to vote, on partisan lines rather than with their hearts and what they knew was right.
I just want to say the National Congress of American Indians, they're a great advocate for teachers who want to, who want to change these negative symbolisms. There is now a national school mascot tracking database, and it's not just the high schools, it goes from K to 12 level. It started in 2020. It's mascots at ncai.org. And that's for any teachers who would be interested in contacting them. And they are so willing to help. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go, Noelle. I have a class now in a few minutes. So I apologize for leaving.
Fine, we're about to.
Bye, Greer.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
thank you. Powerful presentation.
Thank you for having me. And thank you so much, Savannah, Romero, and Dr. Stephen Myers. I'm so proud of you guys. You really are top notch and so needed. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. So, I think it's time for all of us to actually part. And so I'll just bring Greer to the mic. But as the moderator, I want to just say that I'm looking forward. Thank you all for providing this information. And I'm looking forward to working with folks and understanding the next steps for us to continue to address this in New Jersey.
Yes, thank you everyone so much for being a part of today's webinar, today's discussion. And thank you, Noelle, for being an incredible moderator. This was really an impactful day today. So On that note, I'm just going to remind everyone we will be sending some of the resources that were put in the chat, as well as a few resources from the presentations that we viewed today in an email to all attendees, along with the event recording, the link on YouTube. So you'll get all of that via email. You can also find recordings and resources from our last 2 webinars on the Historical Commission's website, which is history.nj.gov. I will also include that in the email to all attendees today. But thank you all so much for participating. And on that note, I'm going to play us out on our commercial, our upcoming events commercial. So stay tuned for some news about events, and then we'll sign off. So thank you all so much again.